The first part and the second part, we talked about the rise of Nazism, and the second part we talked about the actual war itself, how Hitler fought the war and eventually, of course, lost. Tonight and next week we're going to be dealing with a very specific part of National Socialism, and that is the racial views on the world and how that came to affect especially the Jewish people until what they call themselves the final solution, or as we call it, the Holocaust. And next week we're going to talk about something that I think that is relevant to every single one of us and to all people around the world, is faith after the Holocaust. I mean, but we'll leave that for next week. Today we're just going to talk about all of the things that led up to the death and the murder of 6 million innocent people. When Adolf Hitler was in prison in the middle of the 1920s for a failed push that they tried to take over in Munich, he wrote the first part of what was called Mein Kampf, My Struggle. My Struggle was basically the blueprint of the National Socialist Party, of which he had become a member in 1919, and eventually that he would take over the leadership of the Nazi Party. And in there he basically wrote that the goal of the Nazi Party was A, to take over Germany. I mean, politically, I mean, as we studied last month, that Hitler wanted to do it legally, to take over and to ultimately rid the world of one of the biggest problems that the world had faced, and that was the Jewish problem. And the Jewish problem at its root was not religious in and of itself. I mean, Hitler was not writing a polemic against Judaism, but what Hitler was writing was just a statement that the problem that existed among the Jews was racial. Now, why is that important to understand? Why is it important to understand that Hitler was now charting a new course in anti-Semitism? For the past 2,000 years, we have faced anti-Semitism, primarily coming from the religious community, such as the Catholic Church and others, Martin Luther in the Protestant Church. Now, the caveat to religious anti-Semitism always was that there was a way out. What do I mean by that? That means if you were a Jew and you decided that you couldn't take this anymore, that the anti-Semitism was too much pressure on your life and you had to live, you could convert. There was always a way to get rid of anti-Semitism, and that was it, to join. Well, you know, I mean, 1492, the Catholic Church, through Torquemada, the Spanish Inquisitor, through the Great Inquisition, forced thousands and tens of thousands of Jews to convert. Some stayed Catholic, some reverted back to Judaism eventually, but certainly this was a way that Judaism could deal with that kind of anti-Semitism. From time to time, national anti-Semitism rose up through the ages, such as Bogdan Khmelnytsky in what we call Tach V'Tat, the Cossack revolution that took place in 1648-49 in the Ukraine, where a number of nationalist Cossacks rose up to overthrow the Polish lords. The Polish lords had ruled over much of Ukraine. They were what we call absentee landlords. They didn't care really much to get involved, so they let the Jews run as their middle management. And when Bogdan Khmelnytsky, a great Cossack Ukrainian patriot, rose up, they murdered about 200,000 Jews during that time. And we call that the pogroms of Tach V'Tat, which is the year in Hebrew, 1648, 1649. Even there, again, it was primarily based upon economics. It was based upon partly religion, but it was not a racial kind of anti-Semitism. Only when the 20th century rolled around, and Hitler, who was raised in Vienna, he was an Austrian by birth, and at the turn of the century it was prevalent in anti-Semitism. I mean, the Viennese mayor was a well-known and outright anti-Semite, and Hitler brought into existence what we call today racial anti-Semitism. That it didn't make a difference whether a Jew was religious or whether he was Orthodox, whether he was conservative, whether he was Reform. It made absolutely no difference. The mere fact that the Jews were around was already a sorrow state for the world. Not only for Germany, but for the world. And as we talked about last time, that the Jews got it from both sides. The Bolsheviks, the communists, always accused the Jews of being capitalists, international capitalists. The capitalists, the fascists, accused the Jews of being Bolsheviks, communists. So wherever you went, you couldn't get away from it. I mean, to paraphrase the last scene of Schindler's List, if you remember seeing Schindler's List, it was after the Jews had been liberated and they were encountered by this Russian officer on a horse, and they asked him, where should we go? He says, I don't know, they don't like you in the East and they don't like you in the West. They just don't like you. So here were the Jews stuck in the middle, and Hitler primarily accused them of being Untermenschen. I mean, below people. I mean, they were vermin. I mean, they had no rights. I mean, they were just terrible. I mean, they caused everything bad to go on to the world was blamed upon the Jews. And he was, when he will eventually rise up to power, going to finally take care of this problem. So racism was at the very, very core of National Socialism, of what we call Nazism. Now, you see, a lot of people talk anti-Semitism. A lot of people, when they're on the campaign trail to rouse up the public, they make fiery speeches. They take very, very extreme positions. You know, here today, if you look today at the American political scene, you will see that who gets heard? Is it the guy in the middle? Is it the guy that's saying, well, maybe we ought to, we should have? No. The guy that gets heard are on the extremes. The guy that says this and this and this and this and this, and the other guy that counters with that, that, and that. So the thises and the that's, the more extreme, the more you're going to get heard. But we all know that a politician, when they're campaigning, are going to take extreme positions. So if you're a conservative, you're going to blast the liberals. And if you're a liberal, you're going to go after the conservative. And we know that when you eventually end up in office, you know, you're going to soften up. You're going to kind of start to realize that you're going to fight for the middle, not Hitler. Hitler was the one politician in the world that did exactly as he said he was going to do. And to the T, because he was not a politician. Hitler was a fascist. And a fascist is a guy that sets out with an agenda, with ideas, and he was going to fulfill them. In January 30th of 1933, Hitler arose to become the Chancellor of Germany. We talked about that last time. This gave him an opportunity of trying to implement some of the ideas that he proposed in Mein Kampf. And today, we are going to deal exclusively with this issue of the Jews. Now, in the beginning, for the first 6 years, from 1933 to approximately 1939 to the Polish invasion, the basic ideal and conviction of the Nazi Party was harassing and expulsion of the Jews. We wanted to get rid of them. I mean, they ran Germany. Germany was then a country of several 100,000 Jewish people, and the Jews within Germany could not believe it. They couldn't believe it, because you have to understand that German Jews were extremely loyal and proud of being German. This was very different to the extreme of where Polish Jewry or Russian Jewry, which never prided themselves on being a Russian or a Pole. I mean, very few Polish Jews walked around saying, oh, look at me, I'm Polish. No, that was this. We're Jewish, and we live within Poland. I'm a Jew, but I happen to be living within Russia, not German Jews. German Jews were extremely proud that they were German. Many of them spoke German fluently. I mean, and they go back for 1,000 years, close to 1,000 years, that Jews had lived in Germany and produced some of the greatest Germans. Moses Mendelssohn, Felix Mendelssohn, composer, and Albert Einstein, to name just a couple of German Jews. Okay, so the Jews, while listening to Hitler's rhetoric, figured to themselves, you know what, the guy's a bit extremist, but like most politicians, they'll come sometime in the middle. They're not. What did we do? As a matter of fact, many Jews looked into their closet, and what did they see in their closet? Uniforms of the First World War, where they fought for the Kaiser. They were World War, and many of them were World War heroes. They had medals, and they were recipients of great fanfare. So they themselves could not believe, and they always, somehow it became like, not a chuckle, but you know what, okay, the guy's a little off his rocker. But once he chaps it, once he begins to understand that Germany cannot get along without the Jews, he'll soften up his position. Not only did the Jews feel that way, but even the politicians and the political, industrial, and the powerful industrial leaders within Germany felt the same way. That, you know what, Hitler will be a very good uniter. He'll unite Germany, and then once he's in power, we'll tell him what to do. You know, I mean, because that's who runs a country. Usually the army, the industrialists, so don't worry. Well, so the first 6 years, for Hitler began this series of basically boycotting. I mean, we all saw the pictures of German soldiers standing in front of Jewish shops, you know, protect Germany, don't buy anything Jewish, harassment, I mean, you know, beating up a Jew, but not in a very organized fashion. I mean, they would take a Jew, beat him up, cut his beard, you know, parade him around, do all of these things. Purpose was, get them out. Let them leave Germany. And there was no restrictions of Jews leaving Germany at that time. They wanted them out. That's when a mass exodus came here to the United States, where among them were Albert Einstein and people such as that, when they, you know, leaving Germany. The problem was, sure, hindsight is 2020. Of course, had we known now, we know then what we know now, who would have stayed? No one would have stayed. But they couldn't believe it. I mean, these were Jews that were entrenched, and many of them were intermarried. Many of them already had German, you know, Aryan husbands and wives and children, and they had careers and they had businesses. So the first thing Hitler says was he expelled all Jewish professionals. I mean, doctors, lawyers, professors, accountants, suspended them. They threw them out of their positions. Okay, you know what, okay, so he suspended them. The next thing, he took away their citizenship. Jews could not be German citizens. You can't be a citizen, can't vote, you can't have any legal rights. In 1935, they passed the Nuremberg race laws. The Nuremberg race laws should have given us at least a little bit of a hint into what was coming, because Hitler forbade any intermarriage between Aryans and Jews. Now here already, we're starting to see already a little bit more insidiousness. Now, you know, you can break up the unions, you can dismiss people, you know, let them, if you don't want them in the ranks of professorships, okay, you know, all right, they can find other work. But when you start talking about forbidding, you know, groups of getting together, where you absolutely forbid one group from dating another group, already it starts to get already very, very personal. It came to a head in November of 1938, when we had what we know today as called Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht was already an organized, government-sanctioned pogrom, where they went around Germany that evening, smashing synagogues, burning synagogues, killing Jews in an organized fashion. Thousands and thousands of Jewish businesses were destroyed, hundreds of shuls were burnt to the ground, and hundreds of Jews were killed. Again, it was haphazard. It was not where, you know, you went out, you went into a town, you smashed the windows, but the government had sanctioned this. By this time already, by 1938, Hitler had already set up a series of what they called concentration camps. Now, concentration camps should not be confused with death camps. We will come to death camps. Concentration camps were places where Hitler sent political prisoners, such as, number one enemy, communists. When he forbade the communist movement, and they insisted on remaining communists, he rounded them up, and the first concentration camp was Dachau, which was in the southern part of Germany. Eventually they built Buchenwald, and they built others, about 10 different concentration camps within Germany. But concentration camps were seen by the average German as a place where, you know, Sing Sing. We have prisons here, we have Alcatraz, and then Sing Sings, and then all the other places here in America. They were seen as prisons for political prisoners. By 1938 already, the Jews started to feel the heat. But Hitler, until that time, only controlled Germany. I mean, it was a very small geographical area compared to what he was going to eventually control at the height of his power. September the 1st, 1939, after a series of tremendous mishaps by the Western Allies, by the Munich Conference. I mean, they misread this guy, and we talked about it in great length in last lectures, how it would have been so easy. It would have been so easy at so many periods of times to stop Hitler, had the West understood him and had taken him seriously. But we had Neville Chamberlain that was negotiating with Hitler during the Munich Peace Conference. We had others that, and it never happened. And slowly but surely, by taking the Sudetenland and by giving him annexing Austria, the West had absolutely abrogated to Hitler. Whatever Hitler wanted, and Hitler learned from this, that what? The West is weak. And who also is weak is not only is it Britain that's weak, but he underestimated the United States of America. Because he saw that no one is saying anything. I mean, you annex Austria, you take part of Czechoslovakia, you do all of these things and no one fires a single bullet. Not one bullet is fired, no one stands up to him. Over and over he breaks the Versailles Treaty by rearming Germany, by forming an army, by forming a navy. Every single part of that treaty, he stops paying reparations. Hitler. What's the reaction of the West? Nothing. Who does he sign his first Concordat with? We talked about last time. Who was the first one to sign it with? The Vatican. The Vatican was the first ones to sign the Concordat with Adolf Hitler. Reason, of course, if you talk to Catholic apologists, will tell you that they had only one interest. That their interest was to protect the Catholics within Germany. That was their interest, and that's why they went. Of course, Hitler said, "I'm going to protect the Catholics," and 2 days later he broke the Concordat. As soon as Pope Pius, the eventual Pope Pius XII went home. And we'll talk a little bit later on about the reaction of the Catholic Church to the Holocaust, which really deserves a whole lecture in and of itself, and maybe more than one lecture. But we'll talk a little bit about it. The world did absolutely nothing. Right. September 1st, 1939, Hitler, under the pretense of aggravated assault against German nationals within Poland, attacks Poland. Now, Britain and France had signed a treaty with Poland, and Britain and France had told Poland, listen, you're not Czechoslovakia. You're not Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia, okay, you know what, the Sudetenland, there's a lot of Germans over there, that's one thing. But you, no, you were going to protect. You were going to make sure. Okay? What Hitler found out is that nobody cares about anything else except their own borders. That's it, finished, thank you very much. The moment he did anything, the whole West was, remember what was his great response? Chamberlain, peace in our time. He came back to England proclaiming, Baruch Hashem, thank God, I'm holding him at bay. Yeah, holding him at bay. So September the 1st, 1939, Hitler attacks Poland. Poland at that time had 3 million Jews. 10% of the Polish citizenship were Jewish. By October 1st, Poland had fallen. 1 month, I mean, it wasn't even really a fight. I mean, Hitler came in with panzer divisions. This was called a blitzkrieg, is what the German generals called it. I mean, they just attacked furiously, and there was they came up with horses, and it was a joke. But after the war, after the fall of Poland, all of a sudden, Hitler is now in charge of not several 100,000 Jews, but he has under his control over 3 million Jews now, are under his control. Hitler next attacks the lowlands, Belgium and Holland. Again, nothing. But finally, when he attacks France, the West wakes up. Of course, France, we all know, you can't count on them too much when it's a war. I'm sure they make good wine, but in a war, it's very tough to have them as an ally. France falls, and Britain kind of tries to send troops. We all know about the evacuation of Dunkirk, and they got out, but that was that. Hitler now, this is in 1941, Hitler now controls almost all of Europe. If not all of Europe, Spain at least is neutral, Switzerland is neutral, Sweden is neutral, all the S's are all neutral. He already owns the lowlands. He attacked Norway and Denmark, he took them over, and he took over, all he had to do was fight England. We talked about his resolve of fighting England, But right now, this is summer of 1941. In the summer of 1941, Hitler decided he was going to invade Russia. Now, I want to read to you a statement, and I want you to listen clearly to what Hitler says. This is a statement he made just before he attacked Poland. Okay? Just before he attacked Poland, he got on radio. This is his sixth anniversary of becoming the Chancellor. So this was January the 30th of 1939. Okay? This was just several months before he was going to invade Poland. He says like this. Hitler had this ability to screech and shout and mesmerize the crowd. So I'm not going to screech and shout. Okay? And one thing that I wish to say on this day, which perhaps is memorable, not only for us as Germans. In my life, I have often been a prophet, and most of the time, I have been laughed at. Remember what I told you, that everybody was laughing at Hitler, that he was a crackpot. During the period of my struggle for power, it was in the first instance the Jewish people that received with laughter my prophecies that someday I would take over the leadership of the state and thereby of the whole people, and that I would, among other things, also solve the Jewish problem. We all know what that means. That's a euphemism for getting rid of the Jews, is what he was talking about. I believe that in the meantime, the Rabbinic laughter of the Jews of Germany has been smothered in their throats. Today, I want to be a prophet once more. And listen to this closely, because this says it all about what he talked about. If international finance Jewry inside and outside of Europe should succeed once more in plunging nations into another world war, because who did he blame for World War I? Is he blamed the Jews, the international financiers of dragging Germany into war? So again, if international finance Jewry inside and outside of Europe should succeed once more in plunging nations into world war, the consequence will not be the Bolshevization of the earth and thereby the victory of Jewry, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. January 30th, 1939, 8 months before he was going to attack Poland. And now the Nazi party sits in control of close to 10 million Jews right now. You know, between France and Lithuania and all the Baltic states and all over the place, almost 10 million Jews, 8 to 10 million Jews. How do you solve the Jewish problem? What do you do with it now? Okay, so now we have the Jews. What are you going to do with it now? So they set up on a campaign to try to figure out what they're going to do with the Jews. Hitler puts in charge of the Jewish problem Himmler. Good friend Himmler. Himmler, if you ever see pictures of him, looks scarier than Hitler to me. Hitler, of course he was a madman, but Heinrich Himmler just looks like the ultimate in evil. I mean, the ultimate guy that just gives me the creeps every time I see a picture of the guy. He's not human. I mean, neither was Hitler, but Himmler. Himmler became the Reichsführer, head of the SS. The SS was a group of police, soldiers, army that was their only allegiance was to Himmler and to Hitler themselves. Hitler never, ever gave any orders to annihilate, to discriminate, to harass Jews in writing. Never. David Irving, Yamach Shemai V'Zechroi. Do you know who I'm talking about? David Irving, the revisionist historian, offered about 15 years ago $10,000 if anybody could produce a single letter with Hitler's signature on it to claim that he had given any orders to annihilate the Jews. Irving could have made it not $10,000, he could have made it $10 billion, because it doesn't exist any such, what we know, that nothing went on in Germany without Hitler's approval, much less the resolution of the Jewish problem. So what did he do? Because anything was done within Hitler was done with an escape clause called deniability. Whatever we're going to do, I want to be able to deny it. I never said it, I didn't know about it, I don't know. And this was actually the defense at the Nuremberg trial, the chutzpah, the ultimate chutzpah of these Nazi butchers at the Nuremberg trial. The Nazi leaders, what do you want from us? We didn't know anything. It was Himmler, we didn't know. So Göring and Goebbels and all those guys, that nobody knew anything. Complete deniability. Heinrich Himmler put in charge Reinhard Heydrich, who became the head of this section of the SS to deal with the Jewish problem. Now, what do you do with this? What do you do with them? You got 8 million Jews, what do you do? So they decided first, maybe they'll make what they would call then the government general. That in Poland itself, they were going to set up an area that was not fully annexed by Germany, and they were going to send all the Jews there. That's it. So wherever they picked up Jews, whether it was going to be in France, or whether it was going to be in Holland, or whether it was going to be in Norway, wherever it is, ship the Jews to this government general area, you know, to this like this territory, this outland, and let the Jews live over there and forget about them. You know, so let them suffer, let them build their own places, and that's it. Well, they did do that, but eventually the governor of the government general got exasperated. I mean, there's too many Jews around. I mean, what do you do with all these number of Jews coming in daily, more and more and more? He decided he couldn't take it anymore. So he sent back letters back to Heydrich. We can't anymore. We're finished. There's no more place to go. Okay. So this dumping ground that they had created ceased. They needed something else to do. So they thought they're going to make a Jewish reservation. That's it. Like, you know what we have here? Indian reservations. We're going to have Indian reservations because they didn't want the Jews living among them. That was for sure. They had to cleanse German society with this Jewish infection. So they were going to set up what they called a Jewish reservation. Somewhere in Czechoslovakia, somewhere in Russia, the Urals, somewhere. Okay, this is prior to invasion of Russia, just yet. And last but not least, they came up with what they called the Madagascar plan. You know where Madagascar is? It's a Nowheresville, and that's what they wanted. Who had Madagascar? Who ruled Madagascar during World War II? France. France ruled Madagascar. Who ruled France? Germany. So they came up with a perfect plan. They'll take all the Jews and they'll send them to Madagascar. Who cares? Let them sit in Madagascar and finish them off completely. At least they'll be out of our sight. But then they thought about the logistics. How do you get 10 million people to Madagascar? It's not so easy. You need railroad lines, you need this, you need that, you need that. So that became too much of a headache, so they discarded that. They discarded that. June of 1941, Hitler, in a small resort called Barbarossa, decides that he's going to double-cross the biggest double-crosser, second only to Hitler, Joseph Stalin. Okay? They had signed a non-aggression pact before World War II that I wasn't going to attack you, but Hitler hated the Bolsheviks almost as much as he hated the Jews. Not quite as much, because he hated the Jews more than anything else in the world, but he hated the Bolsheviks and he was going to attack Russia. He wanted to attack Russia actually in the spring of 41. But thanks to his good friend Mussolini, who was not as sharp and as swift, and Italians don't fight as well as the Germans, he got caught up in Greece and Hitler had to back him up, so it was postponed by 2-3 months. You know, you never know. In 2-3 months, the fate of the war switched. In June of 41, Hitler invaded Russia with a blitzkrieg. I explained last time, and I think it's worth it to go over just shortly, why Hitler felt confident that he was actually going to be able to beat Russia. Now don't forget that Germany was right now fighting a war against Britain, right? The war in Britain was still going on. So, and for years, German generals had always feared that Hitler would open up a two-front war. So here they were fighting Britain, but at least on the east, they didn't have to worry. And now Hitler attacked on the east. Why did Hitler feel confident? Because in 1938, Stalin made a push. He cleansed out the entire high command of the Russian army. He basically cleansed them out. So Hitler figured, you know, with new generals, new commanders, it's not going to be that well. Second, Russia had fought a war with Finland. Okay, we're talking about Russia versus Finland, and Finland held strong. They held them back. So he figured, come on, if Finland could hold back Russia, and we are Germany, we're going to... The first 3 months, overwhelming victory for Germany. Unbelievable victory for Germany. They crashed into Russia and they moved at the speed of light. The Russians took their orders from Stalin, and Stalin went back on what they called the scorched earth policy. Meaning they had learned from Napoleon. Retreat and just burn everything. Keep moving back and burn everything. Fight. If you can't withhold them, just retreat. Fight and retreat. Russia eventually lost 11 million soldiers. I mean, if you think about the staggering number, it's simply unbelievable to think that 11 million Russian soldiers died in World War II. That's almost twice as many as Jews that were killed. 11 million, because they fight, retreat, and Germans at the first 3 months, they had completely annihilated almost all of Russia and the front lines. They held them at Moscow. Hitler could not penetrate into Moscow. With the German army, Hitler had sent with what they called the Einsatzgruppen. The Einsatzgruppen were people that belonged to the SS under Himmler and eventually under Heinrich. Their job was that they were not going to fight a conventional war. See, until then, and this is probably one of the reasons why the West didn't attack, possibly one of the reasons, we'll never know for sure unless we had here Churchill and Roosevelt and Stalin sitting in front of us. We could ask them direct questions, but now we're all speculating. But one of the reasons why the West had a tough time believing, because reports had started to come out to the West through survivors, through people that escaped concentration camps, that Hitler was doing this, because in the West, when they fought the war through France, through Britain, through the Low Countries, through the Scandinavian countries, they were fighting a war according to the rules and regulations of international treaties. They were fighting a war based upon Geneva Convention. So, you know, they took prisoners of war, and we took prisoners of war. They kept our prisoners of war, and there was exchange of prisoners of war. So the West, what they saw of the Nazi regime, even though they were hearing rhetoric as Hitler denouncing world Jewry, but what we saw early on, what did we see? We saw an army, civilized. I mean, you know, Rommel, the Desert Fox, was very well respected, you know, and all of these things. And we saw an army that was fighting according. So it was incongruous to say, you know what, this is the same army that's butchering innocent people. It didn't make any sense. So in the West, Hitler fought a clean war, quote unquote clean. In the East, it was over because he couldn't stand the Bolsheviks, and B, he couldn't stand the Jews. And living within in Russia were another 3 million Jews. The orders were given to the Einsatzgruppen that you are not to get orders from anybody except from the SS. You were not under, because normally in a war you have a lieutenant, and the lieutenant has a captain, and the captain has a colonel that give orders. No. The SS were only bidden to listen to the Einsatzgruppen will listen to the SS. What was their job? To march with the army and to literally and physically execute all Jews, all gypsies, all partisans, and all communists. And how do you do that? Well, you do that by rounding up people, digging huge ditches, and just shooting them. And that's what they did. They had what they called mobile murder brigades. And they have letters that the Einsatzgruppen commanders sent back to Berlin, to Himmler. Himmler himself turned out to be a wimpish type of a guy, because he only once came to a death camp, and he got physically sick. Too bad he didn't get worse than that, but that was the only time he came. Letters came back from commanders saying that it's going, but you know what, it takes a long time, because the minimum march, you can't shoot them in the city, the minimum march outside the city is a mile to 3 miles. Now you're talking about marching tens of thousands of people, a mile to 3 miles, many of them women, children, carrying children, infirmed, old, sick people. You have to march them out there. When you finally get them out to the outskirts of town, then you have to actually get them to dig a ditch. It's not so easy, shooting 1,000 people into a ditch. So you have to figure, pick up the ditch, open up the ditch, and then shoot them, and then, after you shoot them, then there's still some people who are going to live, so you have to reshoot them in the ditch. It was time-consuming. And more than time-consuming, it was expensive, because you had to have these mobile murder brigades all over. Stories started to trickle back into Germany that this is what was going on the Eastern Front. Now, Himmler had explicitly given orders that this was to be done under complete secrecy. Why under complete secrecy? For 3 reasons. A, that the German people, they didn't want them to find out about this, because they didn't believe that the German people were ready. Even though, if you read accounts of what were going on at that time, the indigenous people, such as the Lithuanians, the Poles, the Ukrainians, they joined in. They had no problem. I just read, I think Bob had lent me a book which I need to return to him, called Responses of the Holocaust, Halachic Responses of the Holocaust. He gives a little introduction to the Covenant Ghetto. Your hair will stand up, and if you have no hair, you'll grow hair that will stand up on top of your head. I mean, what they did, the Lithuanians, the people that they called friends and neighbors for hundreds of years that lived together in Kovna, it's incredible. I mean, pull them out in the middle of the night, rip people apart, cut off beards, not with razors, literally ripped out of hairs, babies bayoneted in front of their mother. I mean, the worst kind of thing that I could possibly tell you. Uncivilized, barbaric, beyond belief. And pictures were starting to filter back into Germany. I mean, because there were soldiers that were confused. Regular army unit soldiers were confused because they were standing and they had taken over a town, and then all of a sudden these people were marched out and they were machine gunned down, and they didn't know, did they have to include themselves in doing this? Many of them participated, but they were told not to. And there's one picture, famous picture, that of a group of German soldiers, regulars, that are standing around smoking cigarettes with a bottle of vodka, and they're passing around and they're laughing, and in the back are a group of people being shot, literally machine gunned down into this pit. The censors became much more active and forbade any more of these pictures or any more of these letters to go back to Germany. And I plan to explain for 3 reasons. One is that they did not want the German people to know about this. Even though Hitler had campaigned, and I told you that racism and the Jewish problem was at the very core of Nazism, but he didn't believe that the German people were ready to visualize the death of 6 million innocent people, that they were actually machine gunning mothers with babies in their hands. I mean, so that was number 1. 2 is he didn't want the West to find out about this, because had the West found out about it, they would use this as quote-unquote propaganda, which they had done actually in World War I, where the West made big hay about the fact that the Germans were bayoneting innocent people. And they put proclamations in newspapers. So Hitler and Himmler feared that if this got out, if word got out that these Einsatzgruppen, these mobile murder units that were going through Russia, were going to actually be found out, the West would say, look at these guys. This is what, because don't forget, this is in the summer of 1941. Where's the United States? Nowhere to be found. Britain, quiet. France, annexed. No one. So he did not want the West to be woken up with this idea, because lest the people then, could you imagine the United States, if the Jews in the United States found out that millions of Jews are being bayoneted and machine gunned and tortured, what's going to happen? They're going to revolt. They're going to get their government to join in the fight. So quiet. Very, very, very malicious, very quiet, very secret. Now, it's hard to keep a secret, because these Einsatzgruppen, with their machine guns and their mobile murder units, killed 2 million Jews. 2 million Jews were killed, estimated to kill by this. We know Babi Yar, the famous Babi Yar in Russia, where over 100,000 Jews were murdered like this. Now there's no good way. I mean, is there a good way to kill people? But this was, making people dig their own death ditches. They made them undress, stand there naked, old men, women, children. They just gunned them down. I mean, you think about the psychology of the participants of the Einsatzgruppen. These are people that are crazy, that became completely devoid of any humanity, absolutely everything. 2 million Jews were eventually killed by these mobile murder units. But they had sent back letters back to Himmler and to Heydrich that it can't go on like this. It can't go on because it's very expensive. It's very hard. You have to walk, you have to schlep them around, and it's inefficient. It is inefficient. So even though that they had killed close to 2 million people, Hitler gave the order, albeit not in writing, that he wanted now a plan to end. Now this is at the height of when Germany now felt, in the summer of 1941, that they were going to take over the world. This was going to be it. And at that time, they gave the order to Heydrich to come up with a plan for what they would call the final solution. Before we get into the final solution itself and what it encompassed, let's just think for just a moment and reflect upon what was the political situation in the fall of 1941. Hitler was running through Russia like there was no end. In the winter, he would have his first debacle and his first defeat. The turning of the war would happen in the Battle of Stalingrad, when they fought from October of 41 to May of 1942, and they couldn't take Stalingrad. It was a first huge defeat for Hitler. In the winter of 1941, at the behest of his naval commanders, who begged him for a long time that they wanted to destroy American ships, because through the Land Lease program, America was supplying Britain with arms, with goods, and all of that stuff. And the German commanders convinced Hitler that they could, because America was weak. What is America? America was, what kind of an economy do we have? You know what kind of economy we have? We have a consumer economy. We like to produce pictures. We like to make movies. We like to make cars. We like to build homes. We're consumer-driven. Electronics, iPods. Which way when you go into what does everybody want for Hanukkah? They want an iPod. They want a VCR, a DVR. I don't even know already. It's way past already. I mean, you go to sleep for 2 days and there's some new technology coming up. That's what people want, right? Hitler figured America's a consumer economy. They can't build guns. They're not going to build planes. They're not going to be able to, all of a sudden, overnight, they're going to be able to make a wartime economy. He didn't believe it. And Americans were far away. How are you going to transport hundreds of thousands of soldiers over the Atlantic? It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. So Hitler gave the order and gave the nod to Japan. December the 7th, 1941, we all know what happened. They figured they're going to wipe out the Pearl Harbor. It's going to weaken America's defenses on the Pacific, and then they're going to wipe out the American naval fleet in the Atlantic, and this is going to render the United States finished, and that was going to be it. With the attack on Pearl Harbor, and with Hitler's debacle at Stalingrad, what they called it that time, it was Leningrad, Stalingrad, now it's back to St. Pete. It was Leningrad, now it's back to St. Petersburg. You know, it's all changes names every 6 months. But nonetheless, what happened was the war started to take a turn. America now came in, and look what the United States was able to do. Overnight, literally overnight, they went into a wartime economy. I mean, for those that lived here throughout the United States, they bought war bonds. They bought war bonds. Uncle Sam wants you. You know what I mean? People signed up, and then it eventually turned into an army. Hitler had given Himmler instructions to come up with a final solution, which he gave to Heydrich. January of 1942, in a small little suburb outside of Berlin called Wannsee, they had what they called the famous Wannsee Conference. Now, Heydrich was working on this plan a number of months already. He had started in the summer of 1941, and he saw that there was a possibility of using the concentration camps as a holding cell, and not only as a holding cell, but actually to use them as what then we would call a death camp. And with the experimentation of Cyclone B, with the gases at Cyclone B, that they were going to, instead of transporting the Jews and marching them to death, they were just going to bring them into the concentration camps. At first, Heydrich thought that maybe they would use the concentration camps that were set up in Germany. We had talked about Buchenwald, we had talked about Dachau, there were others, about 7 or 8 different concentration camps, but Hitler nixed that plan. Hitler did not want, first of all, it was too public, and why did he want Jews coming into the heartland of Germany for? He wanted to have hundreds of thousands of millions of Jews being transported into Germany. He finally got rid of the Jews. The last thing he wanted was Jews to come in. So they decided that they were going to set up the death camps in Ukraine and in Poland, eastern part of Europe. The first one they set up was in Treblinka. Treblinka was near Warsaw, and they experimented on about 500 Russian POWs. They figured they had hundreds of thousands of POWs, and they experimented on Russian, literally gassing them to death. Just gassed them to death. And when they perfected the solution, Heinrich figured that he has his, this is what he was going to do. At this Wannsee conference was attended by 16 members of the Nazi Party. Not included at this conference was Adolf Hitler, neither was Himmler, neither was Göring, who was very much involved in the final solution. Why? Because Göring, the number 2 Nazi, was given the responsibility of the 40-year plan. And the 40-year plan was an economic plan to make Germany solvent. I mean, it's great to take over the world, but you have to still feed the people. So how do you feed the people? So you know what? The Jews owned a lot of property, and the Jews owned a lot of art, and the Jews owned a lot of jewelry, and the Jews owned a lot of real estate, and the Jews owned a lot of stuff. So when they when the Nazis expropriated all of this stuff, who did it go to? It went in the cachet of Göring. So Göring was very much interested in what was going on with the final solution. He was not present at the Wannsee conference. Neither was Goebbels, the minister of propaganda for Hitler. None of the big Nazis were there. Adolf Eichmann was there, and so was Heinrich Heydrich, and a number of party functionaries. Who was invited to this conference? Invited to this conference were people whose agencies were going to be used to carry out the final solution. Ministers of transportation, you had building people there, you had government officials, and this was done in a quiet little town, Wannsee, in January of 1942. The meeting lasted 1 hour and 15 minutes. There was no dissenting votes. I mean, there was nothing like, maybe we should think. No, even if you believed it, even if you had a sliver of a conscience, you definitely weren't going to express it at this meeting. This was not a Federation board meeting that we have here in the Federation in Long Beach, where everybody expresses their opinion and we fight it out 4 or 5 hours, we scream at each other. No. This was Heinrich Heydrich coming in with a plan that was going to be executed and it was going to be implemented, and there was no dissension and no ands, if, or buts. The construction of 6 death camps were to be constructed. Jews from all over occupied Nazi territory were to be transported there. This was to be kept at an absolute secret. No one was allowed to talk about this. No one was to know what was going to happen, for the same reasons. And I never got to the third reason of why the Einsatzgruppen were kept secret. The third reason was not to let the Jews know what was going on. Right? Because if you figure that if everybody knew about Baba Yar and that we were going to march to our deaths, what would we do? Naturally, we would try to fight. We would at least put up some kind of a fight. So they kept everything on the QT. Everything was quiet, silent. When someone wrote a letter to Himmler after the Wannsee conference and said to him, you know what, this might be a little, extreme. Just if you think about it, what was said at that conference was basically, just to reiterate it so we finally could understand what was going on, is that Heinrich got up there and said that as of right now, we are going to go on a campaign to build death. This was never done before. To build death camps, and we were going to gas everybody. For those that were able to work, we'll let them work. But anybody that was not able to work, we were going to put them to death. We were going to murder them. Now, who was not able to work? So automatically, the elderly, children, the infirmed, many women, right away went to the death. And there was no one said a word in the meeting. Everybody was given their orders. You're going to construct, you're going to transport, you're going to do this, you're going to do that, you'll get the gas. And everybody unquiet, no paperwork, no corporate double, you have to get it stamped by your superiors up the line. Everything was done. When someone wrote a letter to Himmler, his response was made public. And Himmler wrote like this: when we got into this business, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember exactly the words. When we got into this business, we vowed to show compassion to only one people, and that is the German people. To everybody else was a foreigner, an outsider, an Untermensch, a vermin, and especially a Jew. We will show absolutely no mercy. He later told the SS, when he gathered at Auschwitz, and he told the SS that, history is going to record that what was done here was one of the most glorious things ever done in the history of mankind, and you should be proud of the work that you did. Okay, Treblinka was opened up, and they began to transport the Jewish people through rail cars to the death camps. Eventually, Auschwitz was already in business, already before. It wasn't a death camp, but it was already, Hitler had built that. Eventually Belzec would be built. Chelmno would be built near Lodz, Sobibor, Madaniek, these 6 death camps near Lublin. Has anybody been to Auschwitz or to any of the death camps to Dachau? Neither have I, but I would want to go there. I would want to go there just simply to be able to see, what was, what I mean, we see pictures and we've seen, footage and all of that stuff, but I think it's important for us to go see this, because it is a part of history that is, as much as you talk about it and as much as we're going to speak about it tonight, it's so unbelievable that this happened in this century. I mean, we're talking about civilized people, we're talking about people that went to church, we're talking about people that had families, had conscience, people that you met in the street, people you had dinner with the night before. And everything went out the window. In Auschwitz, in the summer of 1943, August of 1943, at the height of their process, they were killing 8,500 Jews a day, just in Auschwitz itself. I'm sure many of you know already what the process was. I mean, the Germans had made it that people showed up at the rail stations by themselves. I mean, many of them were in ghettos. I mean, there was the Lodger ghetto, there was the Warsaw ghetto, there was other ghettos that they began to liquidate. But many people, such as in Italy or in Holland, whenever there was a call to show up to the rail stations, the Jews showed up. Now, why did they show up? I mean, if we got a call today to show up at the Long Beach rail station to go, would we show up? Well, because the Jews thought that they're going to a relocation place. No one believed in their wildest imagination that they're going to death camps, that they're going to their final ride. The Nazis packed them into rail cars. They showed up at Auschwitz generally at night. At night, the cars were opened up. People were completely disoriented. You could have been standing on your feet for 3 days. It's possible for 3 days with no food, no provisions. You were weak, you were exhausted, you were completely disheveled, you were discombobulated, you had no idea where you were, what was going on. There was a lot of lights shining and there was dogs barking, a lot of noise was playing. They huddled you quickly out of the rail cars and they separated you. Right away they separated you. Men and women, men here, women there, and elderly here, children there, back and forth. Then you went through the process, or the selectia, as what they call it, the selection. Could you work, could you not work, could you go? And once, they gave it to the right, to the left. Dr. Mengele was there. My mother my aunt, my grandparents came on after the liquidation of the larger ghetto. They showed up at Auschwitz at night like everybody else, and there was a selection. My mother and my aunt went to the left, my grandparents to the right. When my mother protested and she asked the German, you know what, why they? So the German's response was, and this was a common response, they're elderly, they're going to rest. You're young, you could go to work. And they told my grandparents, as they told everybody else, make sure that you mark your suitcases, whatever you brought along, with your name tags, so that you will have them when you come back. When if a guy tells you that, what are you thinking? It couldn't be that they were going to go getting killed. So they marked their suitcases and the name tags and everything else. Then they were marched. The people that were selected to the death were taken into this place. They told, you know what, you came from a long trip, you're tired, you're going to take a shower, etc., etc. They undressed them, and the SS had already configured 1 Jew per square foot. So they packed them into this huge shower room with basically concrete walls, and once already they were packed in, you know, shoulder to shoulder, stomach to stomach. The doors were closed, locked, and the cyclone gas was released, and it took about 10 to 30 minutes till everybody died. I mean, once already they heard the screaming and the shouting stop, they waited a few more minutes, and they would open up the doors and they would start the process of cleaning out the shower room. Before they had gone in there, they had separated all of their clothes. You know, clothing on one side, the glasses on the other, shoes here, because the Germans wanted to use everything for the war effort. Even with the dead bodies, they had already extracted gold teeth. They cut off all of the women's hair. They were going to use their hair for the war effort. My aunt came out after having her head shaved. My mother thought it was her brother, because my family was Hasidic, and my uncle always got his head shaved, you know, didn't have him. My aunt walks out. My mother at first glance said, what's Rachmil? My aunt says, Rachel, what's Rachmil doing here? But then she looked at it. It was her sister, you know, when my aunt had hair down to here, and it was all gone. So they had people come in, you know, volunteers, and they would extract the teeth of the dead bodies, and then they would move them out, and there was a crematorium. And the first night in Auschwitz, my mother, you know, was in a bunk together with other people, and they said to her, you see that crematorium over there? You know what that is? And my mother said, what is that? And this is already after 4 years in the Lodger ghetto. This was not in 1939, 2 minutes after Hitler invaded. And they said, that's where they're burning the Jews. And my mother said, get out of here. This is in Auschwitz. She had heard rumors, but get out of here. How could a civilized people do this? That was that. And then, you know, after the war, my mother said the worst day in Auschwitz was because they took what did the workers do? Well, what kind of work did they do? They separated the clothing. So this transport of Hungarian Jews had come in, many children, and my mother had to separate the clothing, you know, shoes, clothing, you know. They found in Auschwitz, they found a whole room of baby shoes that they had just set aside, you know. They were gonna use everything. What are you gonna say? What could you say? I mean, you know, you think about this and you think of how there's no words to describe it. I mean, you have in davening, the only thing I could think about is you have in a prayer called Nishmas. And when we say Saturday morning, we say this prayer called Nishmas. And within Nishmas, there is a statement that says that, you know, if all the world was filled, our tongues were like filled, and all the pens would be one pen, and all the paper would be one paper, there still wouldn't be enough to write about how great you are. And I think the same thing is true about the Holocaust on the other side. There's just not enough paper, there's just not enough words, there's not enough thoughts in the world to be able to describe what this was like in going on. And these death camps kept just rolling along from basically the summer or the spring of 1942 till basically the beginning of 1945, to the beginning of 45. The Allies were questioned after the war. Why? Why? Why could you not do this? Why could you not do this? Why couldn't you bomb them? I talked about a little bit last time we talked about Winston Churchill's response after the war, because the British did him a big favor and they defeated him right after the war. He was kicked out of office. He later came back to be Prime Minister once again, but right after the war, the British people were obviously tired of Winston Churchill, and then we had time to reflect upon the war, and they asked Churchill, who was known before the war as a Zionist, a pro-Jewish Zionist. Of course, there's always going to be punch holes in this theory. Someone's going to provide a letter where Churchill wrote an article in 1929, of the Bolshevik Jew. He wrote an article, and it is true, he wrote an article basically challenging the Jewish people of the world, where you have to pick sides. What side are you going to be on? Are you going to be on the side of Trotsky? Are you a Trotskyite, or are you going to be a Democrat? I don't think that's anti-Semitic. Just because you call Trotsky a communist, but he did challenge the Jewish world to take a stand. They asked Churchill afterwards what he thought about why he couldn't do more for the Jews in World War II. And his answer was, and this was again relayed through the State Department, that they felt that the best way to save as many Jews as they could was to defeat Hitler as quickly as possible. And that they gave 150% of all of their effort into defeating him. And to try to divert resources that were somehow going to infiltrate into the heart of Poland, they just weren't ready to do that. Roosevelt was not ready to commit American pilots to fly over Germany, because to get to Poland you had to fly over Germany, and then get into Poland to bomb the railroads. They had argued that they had done that a number of times, not in the concentration camps, in the death camps, but they had bombed railroads through other places in the war, and if you bombed them on Monday, by Thursday they were up again. So there was another excuse. As I mentioned, there was a number of different responses of the Western Allies as to why they did not take more active responses to the destruction of European Jewry. Number one being, of course, that they use all of their resources to fight Hitler and to defeat him. Hitler had actually, prior to the war, sent an envoy to Winston Churchill. He had sent a German diplomat to test out and to see what Churchill's reaction, even though Churchill was not the Prime Minister at the time, but Hitler always kept annoying him, thinking that one day he is actually going to have to face Churchill himself. And he sent this adversary to kind of test the waters of what Churchill was feeling. And the response was, Churchill to the German envoy was, tell your boss that anti-Semitism is a good starter, but a bad finisher. Meaning that, you know what, you're going to be able to gather the resources early on with anti-Semitism. Meaning that, he's going to pump up Germany, and which he did. We were just talking about now, what were some of the reasons for his anti-Semitic stance, besides just being a very ultimately evil person, was he was an expert politician and understood that if there was one issue that could garner support, was anti-Semitism. These were foreign people, they never really fit into the culture, they were always outsider. He could always point to a Jew with the long hooked nose, with the beard, with the money, with the belly, all of these things. Julius Streicher was the publisher of Der Stürmer. Der Stürmer was a paper that came out daily, and the cartoons, you just go, you Google Der Stürmer, you'll see what was going on over there. Every day there were stories about Jews, how they financed the war, and how they were undermining Germany, and how they were ripping off the German people, and how it was the Jews that were behind the Versailles Treaty, and how it was the Jew. And every day, and if you woke up and you were an average German, you figured, hey, you know what? Maybe it's possible, maybe. And as I mentioned before, Daniel Goldhagen, the professor, wrote in his book, Hitler's Willing Executioners, he argues that it was not only the SS. What we talked about tonight was a certain group of Einsatzgruppen, a special murder, of murder details. But the vast majority, he argues, of Germans agreed to Hitler's racial policies. Whether they were willing to stand up there and shoot somebody, that's a different story. But they had no qualms about it. They had no qualms about it. In the United States, here, We know it was documented after the Freedom of Information Act. We know correspondence with the State Department and President Roosevelt, FDR, back and forth of why he didn't do much. I mean, you can have a number of different opinions. People curse FDR, they spit at his name. I mean, say that he was a blatant anti-Semite. Other people don't blame him. Other people say he didn't know, or they kept it a secret. And finally, when they did know, it was too late. I mean, etc., etc., etc. There's never going to be a clear-cut answer. Certainly, I believe that more could have been done. I mean, even as a symbolic act of bombing the railroad station, even if they would have gone down on Monday and got up on Thursday, at least the Germans would have known that we were taking this seriously. They would have done something. I mean, it would have made a statement that we're not putting up with this. But it didn't happen. It didn't happen. I think it's interesting to talk a little bit about the church's role. I mean, primarily the Protestant and the Catholic Church. No, Hitler himself was a Catholic. So was Göring. So a number of other high-ranking German Nazi officials. The Secretary of State eventually became Pope Pius XII. Pope Pius XII, if you want to read books about him, there's a book called Hitler's Pope. Just by the name of itself, it could tell you exactly where this book is heading. He signed a concordat with Hitler in 1935. He became Pope, and at that time people were pleading with him to come out with a statement condemning what the Nazis were doing. He refused. And we came to a point of when Hitler began to round up what they called at that time the Pope's Jews. Now the Pope's Jews is an interesting concept in history. What is the Pope's Jews? One of the greatest problems of Christian theology is that we're still around. Right? I mean, if you figure that Jesus came to save the world, and the Jews that condemned him, that were there to condemn him, and should be all in hell by now. Well, why are they still around? I mean, 1 century, 2 centuries, 3 centuries, but the Jew won't go away. So St. Augustine, one of the great early church theologians or fathers of the church, came up what they called with the witness protection program. That you know why there's Jews still around? The Jews are here because when Jesus comes back, there's going to have to be someone that's going to have to stand there and say, oh, we made a mistake. We're going to be the first to greet him and say, Shalom Aleichem, welcome back. And early on we made this mistake. So for years, for thousands of years, the Pope had Jews protected, because if all the Jews in the world assimilate or they get killed or they die out, who's going to be the one that's going to witness to Jesus, that's going to say we made a mistake? If the whole world is Christian, they lose the whole idea of this victory. So the Pope protected Jews. There was a certain amount of Jews in Rome that were called the Pope's Jews. They lived in the shadow of the Vatican, and that's what it was. In 1940-41, there were 8,000 Jews living in Rome called the Pope's Jews. Hitler could care less whether they were the Pope's Jews or the Schmope's Jews. He didn't care. He wanted them rounded up. 4,000 of them were saved by being invited into Catholic monasteries. They literally hid in Catholic monasteries, and 4,000 perished at Auschwitz. This was done by individual bishops, priests throughout Italy. Never did the Pope come out with an official statement condemning Hitler's final solution plan. Never did he come out with a statement criticizing Hitler for what he was doing, etc., etc. After the war, when they confronted Pope Pius, they said to him, Lama, why, you as a moral leader, I mean, okay, you don't have guns, but you as a moral leader, why didn't you condemn it? Or at least excommunicate Hitler? Say, you know what? You are a bad Catholic. You and Göring and Goebbels, all the other, Himmler, all the other Catholics are excommunicated. At least that. At least that. He said, he doesn't think it would have helped. Wouldn't have helped excommunicating them. It wouldn't have stopped Hitler from doing what he set out to do. And as far as condemning Judaism, as far as condemning Hitler's actions against the Jews and the final solution, he also had an answer, because his purpose was to protect the Catholics within Germany. And he was afraid that if he came out too strong against Hitler, Hitler would turn on the Catholics. Okay? This is a moral leader, afraid to make a statement. Couldn't make a statement. Couldn't even have the gumption to get up there and say this is wrong. The Protestant churches, now, that does not say that there were not individual priests, nuns, people that stuck their necks out to save Jewish. There were hundreds of them. If you go to Israel, Yad Vashem, you have the whole section of the righteous Gentiles, people who stuck their necks out, and believe me, for every one of those righteous Gentiles, there are 10 of them that no one knows about, that perished, that died, that went away, that didn't. My mother doesn't believe that, because my mother, to her, forget about it, no one helped. I mean, you know, because in Poland, 90% of Jewry was wiped out. From 3,300,000 survived. So she didn't believe anybody helped anything as far as that's concerned. But there were, for example, Pope John the 23rd, who was the Archbishop of Ankara in Turkey, himself saved over 10,000 Jews. He later became one of the greatest popes and a great friend of the Jewish people. Unfortunately, he only served from 58 to 63, a short period of time, but he was a great man. I think one of the Hasidic Umas Olam, one of the truly righteous Gentiles in the world, was Pope John the 23rd. And there were other Kahena v'Kahena, there were other people like that. And we know that throughout Europe, they stuck out their necks. In America, the Jews here tried to do whatever they could. I mean, you know, we talk about American Jewry and what they knew and what they did and what they could have done. You know, there's a number of different things. Stephen S. Wise went to the president, other people went to the president, they petitioned Congress, you know, but it just didn't work its way out. For whatever reason, we could sit here and speculate a number of different things, whether it was the war effort or whether it was just, you know, it was just callousness, or it was, you know, you're apathetic to the whole situation. It was an internal problem. When we were talking with, you know, with Bob before, you know, and Hitler, and when Churchill made a comment and a suggestion, Hitler became furious and said, you know, this was before the war, and he said, what are you to mix into internal in German politics? For many people, this is an internal situation. Well, you know, what are you going to do? Are you going to save every single country? I mean, if you look around the world right now, you probably have 10 hotspots that, you know, America has a right, you know, could say to justify them from going in, you know, and so that you know, that's the way it was. That's the way it was. As we mentioned, early on in 42, the war began to take a turn against Germany. He saw that it wasn't going to be easy to defeat the Russians, and now America was in. They landed on the northern part of Africa, and they were fighting, you know, under the leadership of General Patton and General Montgomery of the British Army. The Anglo-American Army attacked North Africa, and they defeated Rommel. He became more incensed, and Hitler became much more aggressive in pursuing the Jewish solution, the final solution, where commanders of his were urging him to forget it, you know, forget about it. I mean, you know, whatever he wants. No, he became more obsessed with killing the Jews now. So as the war was turning against Germany, he was turning more and more into making sure that the concentration camps and the death camps were working at full steam ahead. So for anyone who just wants to propose that Hitler only had anti-Semitism as a political tool, this dispels all of those notions. I mean, it was not only a political tool. He was downright an anti-Semite who viewed the world would be a better place without the Jews. I mean, and as I mentioned to you, in August of 43, Auschwitz was killing up to 8,500 Jews. Eventually, what happened is that, of course, the Allies, you know, had landed eventually in Normandy, and they eventually landed in you know, they attacked through Italy, and by the winter of 1945, basically the Third Reich was no more. The death camps still continued to exist, you know, a little bit further. They wouldn't be liberated until the spring of 1945. The British liberated Bergen-Belsen, and the Russians liberated Auschwitz. Later on, General David Eisenhower marched through the people of Auschwitz through the death camp, because of course they claimed that they knew nothing of it. I mean, they were sitting right on the outskirts of the death camp, but they claimed complete ignorance, the Polish gentry. And the world, for a split second, said to themselves, how did it get to this? How did it get to this? I mean, I think that sense of guilt lasted just long enough for Israel to be established. Because afterwards, everybody forgot about it. The German, eventually what happened is on April 30th of 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker, and in one of his last letters that he wrote, stated and claimed that it was because of the Jews that World War II was defeated, and eventually it could take a century or a few centuries, but the hatred towards a Jew will never die, and someone will rise up again to finish off the job. That was his last comments in this world, and with that he poisoned himself, or shot himself, poisoned and shot himself, shot him and poisoned himself, whatever it was, and burnt, whatever wasn't enough, what happened. No one could believe it. I mean, when the world was, when the concentration camps were opened up to the world, and we all saw pictures. I mean, we've seen the pictures of the survivors, of what they look like. I mean, these are not even people. I mean, you look at them, you don't even view these people as humans. I mean, they are skeletons. I mean, these people are nothing. I mean, they're walking shadows. They're walking. I mean, it was nothing. The world was in basic shock. I mean, complete shock. I mean, Hitler had caused the death of 55 million people. 20 million Russians were killed, 6 million Jews, 8 million Germans, primarily soldiers, 500,000 Americans, 500,000 British, hundreds of thousands of French, millions of just various peoples, various peoples. Sure.
When I was in Yad Vashem last winter for a special seminar on the Holocaust, they had, and I saw, an order that Himmler sent because they found out that there was one Jew in Athens, in a small village in Athens, that they missed. They sent a train. There was an order for a train to veer this way, to go and get this one Jew and bring him to Auschwitz. So this is how obsessed they were.
This is how obsessed they were,
yeah.
With this.
Yeah, and the other comment I want to make, when you mentioned your mother saying that nobody really helped, I was in a lecture in a Chapman University. They had
the Holocaust, sure.
Holocaust studies faculty, and they had a whole group of people who spoke about how there was those wonderful people, Christians, who saved the Jews. And they spoke about, we were there and we saved and we hid. And one Jew stood up there, one survivor, and he said to them, so where were you? How come I didn't see you? So
I mean, it's hard to judge. Go know if we would be put in the position. I don't want to be put into, the position, but it was too few, too late for too many. That's what basically it was. Because it doesn't happen in a vacuum. This does not happen. The destruction of 6 million people just doesn't happen with 3,000 SS soldiers. I mean, that's what basically the SS were made up of. 3,000 people. It doesn't happen. You need tens of thousands of an infrastructure to drive the trains, to get to the trains, to build the concentration camps, all of this. And what you really need is tens of millions of people to do this. I don't care. I don't care. I'm not going to go out there and actually start shooting, but it doesn't affect me. As long as my family is protected, as long as I'm protected, whatever happens on the outside, that's their business. The German people went through a tremendous amount of shame and guilt after World War II. I think they were the only ones, really. The Austrians had never really accepted blame as much, but the Germans were shamed into what they did. I mean, the world looked at this and they said, I mean, come on. I mean, this is what was done in your name, by your people, by your leadership. I mean, and Germany, I think, went through a bit of a catharsis after the war. I mean, it's not easy to have this smacked into your face by the rest of the civilized world that could, even Britain and America, and to parts, whatever was France, whatever, could always justify by saying, listen, we fought the war. I mean, okay, yeah, we didn't do anything as much as we could have, but at least we were on the side of saving the Jews. The Germans couldn't say that. I mean, the Germans were not saying they were busy fighting against Hitler. They were not. They were accessories to it. There's so many different little tributaries that come out of the Holocaust. I mean, talking about Hitler's Jewish soldiers themselves. I mean, there's a book written, and there's a number of different dealing with the SS itself, the psychology of the SS, of Hitler himself. I just was watching C-SPAN a couple of weeks ago, and they had one of the lawyers Nuremberg, one of the prosecutors at the Nuremberg trial, he was giving a lecture at the International Law Center in Washington to a number of young lawyers and law students. One person stood up there and said, "What did you think about this argument of just following orders?" Because a lot of the Germans argued that all they were doing was following orders. I mean, Hitler gave down an order, and then Himmler gave the order, and Heinrich gave the order, and then eventually it came down to people who actually had to, we had a commandant at Auschwitz, and you had soldiers that were at Auschwitz, and you had the people who pulled the plug. What about the argument of just following orders? And he said, and of course this is absolutely true, that following orders was never an excuse. Because to each one, he asked the same set of questions. Did you let anybody escape? If someone tried to escape, what was your response? What was your response to the suffering of people over there? Now, if you could prove that you helped people escape, like, when no one was looking, if you were only under duress and you were just following orders, why? Because you were afraid that you would be shot. But, if someone ran away, what would be your reaction? Okay, so let him go. If it's not going to hurt me, let him go. Not one of them could bring any documented proof that they in any way assisted, helped, or even tried not to block an escapee. So this argument of just following orders was immediately discarded. Was absolutely discarded from them. And eventually at the Nuremberg trials, they did put to death a number of Germans, and they hung them. And eventually in 1960, I think it was 1961, I believe, they captured Adolf Eichmann, and they brought him to Israel, and they hung him there. And when we talked about Simon Wiesenthal, he just passed away a little while ago at the end of last year, and he had dedicated his life to tracking down these Nazis. At least they couldn't sleep well. If he didn't get them, at least they knew that there was someone in the world that was chasing them. At least that was the effort. And ultimately, why we talk about these things? Because it's not pleasant. If you read about it and you read of what went on in the concentration camp, and just a subhuman, until they killed you, they made you subhuman. Just you wanted to die already. Kill me already. All of these things. We didn't even thought about it. How did Heinrich get to this idea of gassing them? Of this whole approach? Well, they had done this with a number of Germans. What they called experimentation of the Untermensch. They had a number of doctors that experimented on the mentally ill, the feeble, the sick, not Jews. These were German children. They had about 5,000 of them in what they called them in infirmaries. And eventually they killed them. They experimented on them and they actually killed them. And these were Germans, because Hitler, not only did he believe in racism, or in this against Jews, but it was racism against everybody that was inferior. He was the folk. The Aryan nation was, and it might take 1,000 years for this to happen, but he believed it was eventually going to happen. That the Aryan race was going to be the only true race in the world, and everybody else was inferior. When the German people found out about this project, that they were actually killing, children that were mentally ill or deformed or whatever it was, and they only found out by two mothers getting the same kind of letter, where are our children, and somehow, so they found out it became this big hue and a cry, within Germany. They shut it down, but that kind of set in motion this whole idea of putting to death in great numbers, the Jews, eventually, doing that because of the messiness of just random shooting and these mobile, death squads. So there was a lot of things that were going on in Germany. There was a bunch of doctors that, just if you think about that, how insane it was that doctors who took a Hippocratic oath to help people were used in these vicious, sadistic, twisted experiments on children. It's just surreal. It's like, you want to sit there and you say it can't happen. There's no way to happen. And ultimately, which we will be discussing next week, is to a religious person, where was God in all of this? If you believe in a compassionate God, where was God in all of this? Hitler went through a number of death threats. They eventually they put a bomb next to him, and it blew up. He was 6 feet away. It punctured his eardrum. It shattered his arm, but he survived. I mean, a number of different things. In World War I, he was a runner. A number of times he was wounded. Why? I mean, God could have just sent the bullet 6 millimeters down. It would puncture his head, his heart, something. I don't know if he had heart. I mean, I'm sure if you opened up Hitler, there was no heart, in that body. But why? So this is a question that we need to discuss, because this affects us. I think next week we'll talk a little bit about faith after the Holocaust and how people took different positions and how we, look at it and say to ourselves. Because when I was a student rabbi, as many Chabad student rabbis do, we had this route. I mean, I don't want to say it's like the Mormons where you do missionizing, but it's like missionizing, and I ended up in Maplewood, New Jersey. And we had our tefillin, and me and this other student would walk around and look for Jewish businesses. Are you Yiddish? Give me your hand. Put on tefillin. And we found this tailor who was a Holocaust survivor, and for 2 years we visited him almost every week, and he absolutely refused to put on tefillin. He was our toughest customer. I mean, everybody else, this is the early 70s, many people were experimenting in drugs, and this fit perfectly into their lifestyle. Hey man, why not? They roll up the sleeves and just roll up. This was, because we always claimed it's pot. Put on tefillin. Hey man, you want some pot? Yeah, sure, okay, put on tefillin, roll up your sleeve, put on the tefillin, or LSD, let's start davening, all those slogans that Chabad took, took over. So, all of these things, but the tailor, and we always said, you know what, this is going to be our challenge. Every Friday we woke up, got on the Erie-Lackawanna train from Morristown, New Jersey to Maplewood, and we got off and we walked to his tailor shop, and there he was sewing a pair of pants, and we would say to him, would you like to put on tefillin? No. Are you sure maybe this is the week? No. And his answer always was, where was God? I mean, I went through hell, and there was no tefillin there at that time, and there was no God there at that time. And listen, we were young guys, and I was not, both of us were not foreign to the Holocaust. I grew up with this since I'm a little kid, but here was an outsider that we can actually have a serious discussion with, and there was nothing you could say. To the pot guy, to the guy that, the next door was this record store, and who was in a record store? It was these young guys, there's the 70s, and everybody's playing this psychedelic music that was going on. So to them, it was we could have a discussion of why to put on tefillin, and they can relate to it. But to this man, there was nothing. There was no faith. That he had lost. He had left his faith back in Auschwitz, and as Elie Wiesel writes in his book, I wanted to compile a book of what I thought would be good reading, but after 17 pages I ran out of space. So you could just go to Google, and you Google whatever you like. But I think one of the books that is a must read, definitely must read, is Elie Wiesel's Night, which is his story of the Holocaust, which is just a most unbelievable. Just a most unbelievable story, of the Holocaust, and he writes in there that there was a time he was in Buchenwald, and he was a kid, and some 3 people decided to escape, and they caught them. It was 2 men and a kid. And what they did was, this was common for the Nazis, if you tried to escape and they caught you, they hung you, and then they made everybody else just walk by you. So he was a kid, he was 15 years old at that time, and they had hung these 3, and everybody was marching, and he still remembers, in the back of his head, he heard 2 gentlemen speaking, and one gentleman asked the other, and the kid, the boy was like the middle one, and he was like swinging in the air, and the other gentleman said, where is God at this time? And the other response was, look at the kid swinging in the air, that's where God is. And that had such a profound impact upon, how could it not? How could it not? Just think, who saw Schindler's List here? Everybody saw Schindler's List here. At Schindler's List, you're like shocked. You're speechless. In the theater that I went to, even after a movie, which is a made-up story, it was actors. Liam Neeson was not Schindler. It was not real, and the Gandhi was not the Jewish Ben Kingsley was not the Jewish accountant. You know, all of these things. And Ray Fiennes is not this evil Nazi. Yet it had such a profound impact. For a half an hour, the place was speechless. No one could say a word. You're just like, oh my God. I've experienced, so a 15-year-old kid, and you have 3 people hanging in front of you, had a tremendous impact upon him. As a matter of fact, interestingly enough, after the war, there was a number of correspondence between the Lubavitch Rebbe and Eli Wiesel. And Wiesel writes to the Rebbe that he refuses to get married because he sees no point in it. I mean, why perpetuate this kind of a world? I mean, what he saw was most devastating, and he felt that there's no reason to have children, there's no reason to do anything. I mean, he had lost all sense of purpose and reason to live. And the Rebbe wrote back to him, that kind of an attitude, you know, makes Hitler victorious. Because you know what? Hitler could look down now from hell and say, hey, you know what? He stopped another Jew from having Jews. You know what? He was victorious. So eventually, Wiesel did get married, and he had a child, and it was an interesting set of correspondence between the two of them. And but a lot of people felt that way. I mean, there's absolutely no purpose, nothing to go on, you know, about. So that's a book that I think definitely everybody should read. Then there's another book that's a very, very interesting book. The author of this book was a psychiatrist, Viktor Frankl, that ended up in Auschwitz with all of his writings. And he had his whole, everything with him. His writings were his life. And at the gates of Auschwitz, he had to give away his writings. And he survived in Auschwitz by literally recreating everything he wrote in his mind. I mean, there's no pen and paper. It wasn't exactly where you could, like, hey, sir, maybe I can go down to the stationery store, pick up a couple of pads, maybe a pen or two. It wasn't, nothing like that. And he developed what he called logotherapy. Logo meaning purpose, a purpose to live. That he convinced himself that his wife was alive, even though, I don't remember if she made it through the Auschwitz. At the end of the book, she might have, but he convinced himself, and every morning he woke up and he pictured her. And he pictured them living a normal life, that even in Auschwitz, he would have this normal life, and he would after the war, they would reunite, and they would get back to their lives, and he would write his book and everything. And that literally saved him. And he writes in his book, the name of the book is the
Man's Search for Meaning.
That's
Life in Search of Meaning? Or
like Man's Search, it's Man's Search for Meaning. Man's Search for Meaning. Chaya came up with it. Give her an extra one. Man's Search for Meaning. Because meaning was the purpose of existence. You had to have a drive to survive. I mean, and he said, you know, when I read the book, then I talked to my mother about it. I mean, she hadn't read the book. And when I said to her that Frankl said that in the morning he knew that if someone, for example, even something as mundane as urinated in his bed, like he was just he wouldn't make it. Because it showed that he had just, you know, given up, he just gave up hope. You know, and then he could tell. And then one night, I mean, he tells these fascinating stories. So I think that's another must read. I mean, for everybody to really pick up Viktor Frankl's book, these are small, little, easy books. These are not tomes like, you know, you could buy The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, you know, which is like 1,300 pages, you know, and go through step by step of, you know, of what goes on. I mean, if you have the time to do that, that's great. Another one I would very much suggest is Lucy Davidovich's book, The War Against the Jews. She just, you know, she, again, did a tremendous job in, you know, in doing all of this. And the purpose why we talk about this is very simple. It's not a pleasant discussion, but it's a very important discussion. And the reason is, number one, that if we fail to be vigilant, if we fail in our duties to stand up when there's, you know, injustices done against anybody, that's all it does. That's all it takes. That's all it takes is for good people to remain quiet. Now, when you remain quiet, you become an accessory to murder. And that's really the lesson of the Holocaust. Unfortunately, it has to be drilled in over and over and over again to, you know, to do this. And of course, many people will manipulate these sensitivities. Of course, everybody in their own political bent will use this to justify their position of whatever position they're going to take. But we know, as people, when injustices are done, that if we don't say anything, the end result is the mass slaughter of 6 million innocent Jews. Thank you.
The Pope didn't know that.
What?
The Pope should have heard.
The Pope didn't know
The
that.
Pope.
Yeah, well, you know what? It's
Because it was Jews.
yeah, that's it was, now, Susan says a good one, it was Jews, you know, so, you know what, it was, see, had we lived in a time of slavery, we would have shrugged our shoulders and said, well, listen, this is black people. This is black people, so what does this have to do with me? If I'm a Hasidic guy living in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and I hear about slavery down somewhere in Alabama, I shrug my shoulders and say, you know what is this? This has something to do with me? I don't own slaves, I mean, that is. How many people, in reality, in the 1960s, got up and went down to fight the Civil Rights War? How many people did that? A number of people, sure. A number of people did, and you know, we know about the Cherneys and the Goodmans who were killed. We know about them. You know, but in reality, there wasn't 10 million people from New York, Massachusetts, Illinois, you know, Ohio, Pennsylvania, getting on buses to go down to fight, you know, Bull Connor in Birmingham, Alabama. There just wasn't. It was, you know, sure, this is bad, and discrimination is terrible, and you know, it shouldn't be that, you know, whites sit at a counter and a black guy has to sit outside, or that Rosa Parks has to stand when she works all day, because most people felt, what? I live in Chicago, Illinois. What does that have to do with me? I'm in Duluth, Minnesota. I'm in Duluth, Minnesota. Duluth, Minnesota is a nice place to live. Or I live in you know, Concord, Massachusetts, which we're very liberal, and oh gosh, well, we would never do such a thing. But you know, the rednecks down in Alabama, the rednecks in Mississippi, in Alabama, in Louisiana, in North and South Carolina, yeah, they're cretins, they're morons. But will I actually get up out of my seat, get on a bus, go down there to register black people to vote? What are you, crazy? Nuts or something? This is what it is. Go ahead.
I want to add,
Go ahead. There's a lot to add, believe me.
No.
Anybody could add.
I want to add another reason
Please.
why it's important to keep talking and commemorate it and remember it, and anything we can do is because the survivors are very old.
Oh yes.
And we're not going to have them for too long, unfortunately.
Right.
And they're the witnesses, they were there. Now, if you take these people away from this equation, then everybody else can come and say, nah, didn't happen. Go to Auschwitz, go to the camps now, and they're just parks, and it's beautiful. I saw pictures, I wasn't there yet.
Right.
But it's just pictures and some monuments. So everybody can say, no, it didn't happen. So
Right.
it's
Steven
important to
Spielberg has over
commemorate.
50,000 documented survivors. He you
Yeah.
know, put that on film. He's got-
Exactly, the
and-
Shoah from
The
the...
Shoah
and
from
we
Nation.
can't deny it now.
Yeah, but that doesn't stop people. You see, it doesn't stop people from like guys. People like David Irving and organizations like the Historic Institute Review or HRI, Historical Review Institute. All these guys are revisionists. It doesn't stop them. And what Helen is saying is, as time passes, you know, personal witnesses are fading away. People are fading away. Now, sure, of course, we're going to bring the Shoah Foundation and people are going to tell stories, but you know what happens over time? You know, okay, maybe they did. What can a person say? All a person could say is, you know, I came to Auschwitz and I saw them. Okay, so you know what?
Wait a minute,
So,
can't we prove today that with everything we got, that there was a Holocaust? Can't we do it?
yes, we can prove it. We can prove it, but if you think about this, if you think about the number
People are gonna
6
keep shifting.
million, think about the number 6 million. We only know, how did we know 6 million? There's no way to know that there were 6 million. They kept meticulous records. It was the Germans that kept the records. After the war, we saw, okay, they had the books of Auschwitz. On this day they did this, on this day they did this, and then they calculated it, all of that stuff. But the 6 million, if you think about it, the number is so overwhelming, there is absolutely no way. How do you document the death of 6 million people? Even if you show a picture of Auschwitz, the liberators, okay, you know, people walking around in skeletons. So how many people were liberated from Auschwitz? 1,000, 2,000, 10,000, 50,000 people. Not more than 10,000 people were liberated from Auschwitz. Okay, so they'll say, you know what, 10,000 people, so if you extrapolate it, maybe 100,000 Jews died there. Okay, what do you make such a big deal? Look, you don't have to go further. The president of Iran keeps saying this, right? The Holocaust was a myth, and and if it really happened, so why does Israel have to be in the Middle East? Let Israel.
There's a professor at Long Beach that said that the Holocaust didn't happen, and these are people teaching
our children.
Students.
That's it. It's exaggeration. There's no 6 million. Maybe there's a couple.
Yeah,
We have to keep pumping away at this.
Did I miss something when you were talking about Churchill and what he said?
After the war?
Yeah.
The Churchill basically said after the war, when asked, why he didn't do any more, so Churchill's response was basically that his whole effort was in winning the war. That's what he was 24/7. His idea of saving the most number of Jews was to defeat Hitler. And there was, now, could you say, Churchill, you're a chazer, you had the resources, you could have done this, you could have just signed an order, bombed the sure, you could have. But looking back at 2020, we always said hindsight is 2020. I believe him when he says that his whole effort was in winning the war. Britain was bombed to smithereens. For a time, the war on Britain, they were bombed, and then he was running around, and I'm sure that this was his number one. Now. If you sat down with Churchill and you sat down with FDR, in a room and there was no tape recorders, and you asked FDR, what do you really think about Jewish people? Then you might get a different, then you might find, scratch the surface. You might find a different kind of response. Even though that a lot of Jews love FDR and they vote straight Democrats and all of that stuff, and Churchill, as well. Churchill there's no hiding. Churchill was an unbelievable great writer. He wrote a lot of stuff, so you could do research on Churchill, as much as he wrote an opinion about everything. This was Winston Churchill. When Churchill ate breakfast, it wasn't an individual eating breakfast. This was the British Empire eating breakfast. He walked around. It was bigger than life with that bowler and that and that fat cigar. Ultimately, I believe that he was the hero of the war. Without Winston Churchill at the time, who knows what would have happened. You never know. But it certainly wasn't Charles de Gaulle.
As a follow-up to what Helen was saying, at the Museum of Tolerance in Los Angeles, on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, they usually have some sessions where there's a whole group of survivors that come and lecture at the museum. It's really quite an eye-opener for us, and as you point out, these people they're starting to die off, and there aren't a lot left. And the same thing is true for the soldiers, American soldiers who were there. And I had a patient who helped liberate one of the side camps of Dachau, and these people are now in their 80s or early 90s, and the stories that they have to tell. If you have an opportunity to hear some of these people, it's an indelible impression.
But also,
the
survivors are not clear anymore. They want to talk, but they are crying, and they are not. And if I bring them to my students, the students are impatient because the people are not speakers. They are not professional speakers.
That's why I suggest going up to the museum, because the group of people that they have there have been doing this for a while, and they're very good at talking to a group, because there's often kids in there, they're teenagers, and
there is it's
so if you have
everything's
important,
absolutely, absolutely. And also there was just yesterday, you get 100 emails a day from different sources, going around. But there was an unbelievable email that came through yesterday. There was a song that was put together by some guys. Before you go, you could Google maybe before you go. It's a song written specifically to what you're talking about today, to thanking American soldiers, World War II veterans, and it comes with images, and there's a whole song about them. It is extremely touching. The song is called "Before You Go," because a lot of them, they're dying. I think at the pace they said about 3,000 a day. It's hard to believe at 3,000 a day they're dying, because
Read the obituaries 1919, 1923 born.
Yeah, but that's the years. That's the years. You know, they're dying they're dying every day. That, you know, that's for sure. So if you go onto the computer, just Google before you go. I'm sure it'll direct you. I think it's beforeyougo.com with one of these / something like that, and it's a thank you song to these guys. I mean, of course, the pictures. We've seen the pictures of Omaha Beach, and we've seen the pictures of Iwo Jima. We've seen the pictures of, you know, I mean, all of these things, and we don't really appreciate the sacrifice because, you know, of what these guys did going over there, and, you know, and giving of themselves. There's a foreign war far away. I mean, fighting in the Pacific. I mean, what do you have against? What would I do with the Japanese? You know, Mr.
I'm a member of the Jewish War Veterans, and in the next 25 years, there won't be any more Jewish war veterans, because 90% of the Jewish war veterans in the organization are from World War II.
Right.
And
yep.
It's going to be
gone.
the end. It's going to be the end. It's a shame, but it's going to be the end, because these young people, Jews today in the service, are not joining the Jewish war veterans.
Right. Yeah. It's sad. You know, it's sad, and it's a world that is passing us by. It's a world that's passing us by. We have different problems, different issues now today, and kids in general are not into history. They're not kids today. High school kids and even college kids could care less what happened yesterday, 60 years. They know of the sacrifices that people did. I mean, one of the most touching things in Vietnam. Yeah. Okay. I was not in Vietnam. No, I was not in Vietnam. But one of the most touching things when I went to Washington. Is the Vietnam War Memorial. It is unbelievable. I mean, you know, when you think about the war in Vietnam, I mean, that was like, okay, I could still remember the war in Vietnam. World War II was before my time, but the war in Vietnam, I mean, you know, it's these young kids that just died there, like, you know, just, so if we think about of the sacrifice that Americans have made throughout last century, it's just, you know, it's just unbelievable. But especially true about World War II veterans that, as we mentioned before, are slowly but surely, you know, dying, and, you know, and we owe so much to them, and it's you know, it's just unbelievable. They tell a story, you know, there's a you know, bashing France has been lately, you know, in the news. I mean, everybody, you know, likes to take a pot shot at France, especially since, you know, I mean, America's got to go at this war by itself, and France is this and France is that, you know. So they tell the story of this group of American tourists that are in France, and you know, and this French official, they're exiting the plane, they're coming to customs, and the officials are announcing, please have your papers ready when you come to the customs agent, you know, like everywhere you travel now, if you have to show identification, they ought to have your papers ready. Well, there's one elderly gentleman, he comes up to the customs agent, and he's, you know, fumbling through his book, you know, trying to get his passport. So the agent says to him, I mean, didn't you hear the announcement? You should have had your papers ready before. What's wrong with you? He said, listen, Sonny, the first time I came here was in 1944. No one asked me for my passport then. Okay? All right, so this is, you know, it's one of those, you know, one of those stories, you know, like if you go to the northern part of France and you see the rows and rows of you know, of crosses and some Magen Davids and other things of people that fell there and died on the beaches. It's an unbelievable thing. It's an unbelievable story.
I don't know if you heard about this, but there was a fellow, Tibor Rubin. Mm-hmm. He just got the Congressional Medal of Honor. It took 50 years before he got it. And not to submit sergeant wouldn't put the papers in.
That's right.
I mean, this is
he fought in the Korean War. He fought in the Korean War. 50 years till he got the medal. Till he got the medal. Because an anti-Semitic sergeant wouldn't put his papers in. So now we had to wait till the sergeant dropped dead till he got it. Kenny, you wanted to say something? Tell the story of.
If you can't get to a survivor, there are a number of Czechoslovakian Torahs that are looking for homes that need to be adopted through the Czech Torah Foundation. I think that in Southern California, there are 75 of them that survived the Holocaust. I had an opportunity to meet a woman from Kosovo who was reunited with a Torah that her grandfather prayed with. And a procession of 75 of these that are in synagogues around the greater Los Angeles area. And I think the website is checktorah.org. And I know that they're constantly looking for people to adopt them.
Oh,
Yeah, there's over 1,000, there's 1,000 of them in the United States.
It's unbelievable. I want to tell a story. Kenny, his father, I knew very well his father and his uncle Eugene. Many of you may know Eugene Schlesinger, a well-known family philanthropist here in the Long Beach area. You know, I think Eugene is his uncle. I mean, Julius, I think, passed away in 92.
1991.
90. Wow. So one of the 90.
Yoli as well, too. It's just,
yeah, Yoli as well. There was three of them, and a number of years ago, Eugene, Kenny's uncle, was honored at the Hebrew Academy dinner for, he's a big philanthropist. I mean, everybody in town, knows Eugene Schlesinger. I mean, he's a well-known person here. Long-time members, him and Eva, his aunt. And Eugene got up there, and he's a Czech. He's a Holocaust survivor. His English is not Abba Ibn English. It's not one of these fancy Oxford English. He told a story, not a dry eye in the crowd, and it was his own story of how he was a young kid and left home and all of that stuff, and mother sent him away and packed him up the goods, and in his bag she put in his tefillin. And she said, you know what, you keep this tefillin with you, wherever you go, whatever it is, you do it. Well, anyways, he roams around, the war is coming to an end, he has this bag of tefillin, and it just happens to be that at the end of the war, as the Russians and the Germans are literally facing each other, Eugene finds himself in the position of seeing having a dead German, thinking to himself that, the one way that he's going to survive is he's going to takes off the German uniform and puts it on, figuring, this is going to be his way to get out. So there he's walking in a German uniform with a swastika on his arm, with his backpack on his back, and he's walking down the street. Who should he encounter? None other than the Russians. And the Russians show up. Okay, so here he is, walking with the Nazis, thinking to himself that he's just going to walk through town and get through, and the Russians, are next to, and they're training their guns on him. Now, we had talked about last time what the Russian reaction to the Germans were. I mean, I mentioned to you that a lot of the Germans were found with their necks bitten out because, I mean, this was not a pretty war. Just what the Germans had done to the Russians. The Einsatz group and the Russians did back to the Germans when they came in. I mean, the worst kind of treatment. So here's Eugene, and these guys line him up, and they're ready to shoot. And they line up a number of Germans, and he's standing over there, with a bunch of Nazis on line, and goodbye, Charlie. And then he thinks to himself, hey, he calls over a Russian, and he opens up his backpack, and he shows him the tefillin. And he says, would a Nazi be walking around with tefillin? And the Russian tells him, listen, I don't know tefillin, I don't know shmillin, but I tell you one thing, you got 20 minutes to get out of town or you're gone. He ran, his legs took him so fast that he got out of town that he never looked back, and the tefillin literally saved his life, that day, because what he did here, as he was running out of town, was they were gunning down all the German soldiers right there and then in the town square. So, I mean, and you know what, and Eugene's story is kind of unique to Eugene, but there's 100,000 stories, like this. There's a million survivor stories of everybody with a turn here and a turn there and a twist here and a twist there. We talk about, unfortunately, in the overall picture, there's no happy ending because 6 million did die. But eventually, back to, and just to what Kenny was saying before, and also what Bob was talking about, the Museum of Tolerance up in Los Angeles in the Czech Torahs. And when I was a rabbi in Lexington, New Jersey, there was a dentist there, Dr. Brandes. And he was a World War II veteran, and he was a young soldier in Patton's Third Army, and they came into this one particular town. I think I've told the people, some of the people, the story, and they were swept through the town. There was no Nazis. They took the town, and then all of a sudden he's eating lunch or something, and he gets a call. The lieutenant wants to see him. The lieutenant wants to see him. Doesn't know why. Comes up to the lieutenant takes him into a barn, like a warehouse type of a thing in town, and he opens up the door. There was literally tens of thousands of Jewish books in this thing. The Nazis had packed everything in there because Hitler wanted to eventually make a museum. When he got rid of all the Jews, he wanted to make a museum of what it was like, of not to have Jews around, but what it was like with the Jews. And the lieutenant told him, listen, I'll tell you one thing, you're the only Jew in this, whatever this was, a platoon or whatever. He says, the American army is not going to take these books home. I can guarantee you. And after we leave, God knows what's going to happen to these books. So Brandis, they're all yours. Now, okay, so here's this Jewish private or whatever he was there, you know, like a corporal, standing in the middle somewhere in Europe. He's got 10,000 Jewish books. What's he going to do, start packing them up and writing his name on them? So he said he was young and he was dumb, so he looked for a couple that he could at least recognize something, put them in his backpack, and the rest he has no idea what happened to them. You know, he left there because, you know, he would have liked to have like 3 weeks time, packed them up, but they were you know, next thing you know, they were off to the next trip, and thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of books, you know, were lost in Europe like that. I mean, forget about the Torahs and everything that they burned. I mean, Kristallnacht, I mean, one of the things they did during Kristallnacht was they burned hundreds and thousands of books. There were always book burnings. I mean, the Nazis were big into book burnings. Just anything that was written, you know, was burnt. I mean, because they didn't like anything.
I haven't, okay, maybe you should.
Kai, go ahead.
I know that we've talked a lot about what people didn't do.
Yeah.
Do you know the story, you probably do, of the King of Denmark?
Sure.
A nice light note maybe, or
Yeah.
something to say.
You know what, the interesting thing about the story, the King of Denmark, you know, the Jews had to put on this yellow patch. I mean, they wore this yellow patch on them, identify themselves as Jews. I mean, everybody had their different patches that had to identify themselves with. The Jews wore the yellow patch, and the King of Denmark wore a yellow patch or a yellow armband to signal. Now, this story has been going around for 50 years right now. I have yet to find the source of this story. Now, it's a good story, and it makes me feel good. At least there was someone there that did this. I would like to know the source and see the source of who actually saw him with a patch on him. Now, there is a book that I just got called The Rescue of the Danish Jews, which I didn't, you know, it's part, you know, it's one of the, you know, on the list, maybe in there. But what I do know is in that movie, that's called, we talked about in the beginning of the class, not Schindler's List, but with the kids in Tennessee. Paper Clips. Thank you very much, senior moment. Paper Clips. The reason why they wrote that, the reason why they stayed in the movie, why did they collect paper clips? Why didn't they collect shoelaces? 6 million shoelaces representing the shoes in Auschwitz. Why didn't they collect 6 million pairs of glasses? The reason why they took paper clips, because they claimed that in Denmark, a sign of rebellion was a paper clip. If you wore a paper clip, that was kind of the underground way of saying, I'm rebelling against the Nazis. So I think that there probably is some truth to this, to the king, and I want to believe the story, and I've heard it since I'm a little kid, and my mother has repeated it a number of times, that the king wore it, the king went out in the street with it, and it was really great, and and wonderful, and the Danish people are really great. I mean, they make wonderful furniture, and those Danishes in the morning, is good, but in reality, there were people, there were many great people, there were many, I mean, we could spend a whole evening talking about Raoul Wallenberg, right, who was a non-Jewish guy killed by the Russians, murdered, in the 50s. We could talk about the Japanese, envoy to Lithuania, and how many thousands of Jews he saved through rushing them up, getting this. There were a number of heroes and heroes and heroes, in the war, and these people go down as really not heroes, but superheroes, because you understand the fear that people were under, I mean, the pressure that people were under, I mean, to do this. I mean, you were found, even if they suspected you of doing something like this, you were immediately murdered. I mean, you were killed, your family was killed. I mean, eventually Heinrich was killed. I mean, they killed Heinrich in 1944, and Hitler went on a berserk, they burned and they massacred thousands of people because of this. So the people they're not heroes, they're larger than life, type of people that did this, and they get all the credit, get credit in the world. Just to finish the point about the King of Denmark, they tell a story once about a great Hungarian rabbi who was called the Chassam Sofer. His name was Chaim Sofer, and his student was once, I think, accused of stealing something, and he was taken to court, and his lawyer said Judge, let me say this. This man's rabbi, Chassam Sofer, once was underchanged, no, someone stole something from him. Somebody stole something from him, and he chased the thief down the street screaming, I give up ownership of the article, I give up ownership of the article, because he didn't want the thief to transgress the sin of stealing. So he ran down the street literally saying, I give up ownership, I don't want it, I don't care, it's not mine. So the judge says, do you expect me to believe that such a story took place? So the lawyer looked at the judge and said, Judge, let me just say this. Whether the story took place or not, they don't tell the story about me and you. Let's put it that way. About me and you, they're not going to tell the story, but about the Chassam Sofer, they told the story. So whether it's true or not is irrelevant. That's the kind of person he was. And I say the same thing about the King of Denmark. Even if the story is not true, they didn't say this about Charles de Gaulle. They said this about the King of Denmark, and for that itself, he deserves tremendous kudos. Just for having the story said about him.
And to add to it,
right.
The Yad Vashem scholars, all of them, whoever spoke in that seminary, kept saying that the story about this king, the Denmark king, is almost like Torah Sheba'al Peh. It goes from...
It's a legend that goes from one place to another.
There's nothing really to it. I mean,
yeah, I mean, again, it doesn't make a difference whether it's real or not real. It doesn't make a difference. The fact is that they said this about him proves that he had at least the qualities for this story to be true. Because if they had said this, you know this about Himmler. That Himmler one day woke up and he wore a yellow star. No, they're not going to say this, and they're not going to say this about many people. About him, they say it because he could have done it. He could have done it, and for that is a dayenu. That's enough of a proof to give this man honor and great honor. You know, listen. You know what? As we said during the class, there's a million different things that we could talk about, and we didn't talk about every person that died in the Holocaust. Everybody has a story, and everybody had a life, and a whole. Not only were 6 million people killed, but a whole civilization was destroyed. I mean, an entire civilization was completely wiped out. And next week we'll try to tackle the question from a different perspective, more of a more current perspective, is how do people like us view and talk about, you know, God in all of this type of scenario.